In the year 1440 in France, it was said that some people were disappearing. These disappearances soon began to be mentioned alongside the name of one of the youngest marshals in the country. This man was not ordinary. He had fought side by side with Jeanne d'Arc. He had become a marshal at a very young age. He was an aristocrat. He was wealthy enough to raise his own army. But now, people were no longer talking about the battles he had won. They were talking about his castle, closed for a long time, because this castle was said to circulate texts the church considered dangerous, to host pursuits that pushed the limits of faith, and for years had been spoken of only in whispers. That is why some disappearances no longer seemed like coincidence, and history has shown us this time and again, power that cannot be questioned, sooner or later creates a dark void. For Gilles de Rais, that void had already begun to form. If you are ready, let us step into that darkness. Rise, power, and untouchability. France, 15th century. This was an age not only of war, but of absolute noble power. The 100 Years' War had drained the country for nearly a generation. Villages burned, fields lay empty. People had grown accustomed to living in poverty and fear. In this world, power was not measured only by the sword, but by land. Those who owned land ruled people, and Gilles de Rais was born at the very center of this order. In 1404, he was born into one of France's oldest aristocratic families. Even as a child, he was more than an ordinary noble. His grandfather, Jean de Craon, was known as a wealthy and influential figure with direct ties to the crown. From a young age, Gilles became heir to immense wealth and numerous titles, castles, lands, sources of income. These vast estates, stretching across Brittany and Anjou, gave him not only riches, but almost unlimited freedom of movement. That freedom was the first point that set him apart from his peers. But what truly distinguished Gilles de Rais was not only the family he was born into. He began military training at a very early age. He learned discipline, the use of the sword, army formation, obedience, and command. The courage, composure, and discipline he showed on the battlefield quickly drew attention. While his peers were just stepping into knighthood, Gilles de Rais was already rising in the eyes of the crown. The turning point of this rise came during one of the most fragile moments in French history. The ongoing war with England had exhausted France. Morale was broken, the army was scattered, the people were hopeless. And in this darkest moment, a young woman stepped onto the stage, Jeanne d'Arc. Her appearance created not only a military shift, but a psychological one. Gilles de Rais fought on the same side as Jeanne d'Arc. He entered the battlefield with her, marched beneath the same banner. Sources state that he played an active role during the Siege of Orléans in 1429. He began to be known as one of Jeanne's most trusted commanders. This alliance placed Gilles de Rais' name among France's heroes almost overnight. At the coronation of King Charles VII, he was honored. This ceremony officially confirmed his position in the eyes of the crown, and shortly after, he was declared one of the youngest marshals in French history. This title meant more than military success. It was also a sign of extraordinary trust from the king and the state. Gilles de Rais was now a war hero, a marshal, an aristocrat, and the owner of nearly limitless wealth. This power made him untouchable for a long time. In that era, questioning a noble, especially a marshal who had served the king, was almost unthinkable. People did not speak of him, they did not write of him, and what was heard was often treated as unheard. Gilles de Rais did not use his wealth only to live in luxury. He staged grand theatrical performances in his castles, hosted lavish feasts, and welcomed nobles and artists alike. If he wished, he was powerful enough to raise his own army. His castles were larger and more fortified than the villages around them. But it was precisely this power that would later give rise to the most dangerous question of all. How and why did such a powerful man end up alone? Because history has shown us repeatedly, absolute power first brings silence, and silence brings darkness. And it is here that the story of Gilles de Rais slowly begins to change direction. Loneliness and mystery. The capture of Jeanne d'Arc and the silence that followed left a deep void in France. But this silence did not mean peace for Gilles de Rais. The battlefields were empty. The days of glory were over. And one of France's youngest marshals was beginning to drift away from his former life. Gilles de Rais gradually withdrew from his official duties, from the court, from the battlefield, from crowds. But this withdrawal was not complete isolation. His surroundings were still full. Servants, assistants, noble connections. Yet this circle was becoming narrower and quieter. Those once consulted, advised, and treated as equals were now reduced to figures who only followed orders. Gilles de Rais had not lost his power, but that power was no longer outward-facing. It was turning inward. The gates of his castles closed more often. Guests became fewer, visits more rare. This created uncertainty among those around him. No one truly knew what was happening, but everyone felt that something had changed. Gilles de Rais spent most of his time in his castles, especially at Tiffauges Castle. It was said that he was establishing a new order there, away from prying eyes. This order was not completely isolated, but contact with the outside world was tightly controlled. Who entered, who left, when and why. Fewer and fewer people knew the answers. His fortune began to erode rapidly during this period. Lavish celebrations, expensive theatrical productions, travel. What once symbolized his power was giving way to a quieter, more closed life. But this silence was not retreat. According to some observers, it felt like preparation. Gilles de Rais was trying to recreate the sense of control he once held on the battlefield, in another realm. This realm was not yet clearly defined, but within his castles, an unusual intensity could be felt. Some rooms remained closed longer than others. Some activities were carried out only at specific times and with specific individuals. Servants learned not to ask questions. Because this period was not one in which Gilles de Rais lost power. It was one in which he concentrated it into a narrower space. And that narrow space would soon become the foundation of a mystery spoken of only in whispers. The Dark Pursuit. When Gilles de Rais withdrew into the grand yet cold corridors of Château de Tiffauges, loneliness was no longer temporary. It had become permanent. This loneliness was not seclusion. It was a deliberate separation. A gradual withdrawal from the outside world, from people, and from ordinary life. This massive castle rose in the Vendée region. Its thick stone walls, high towers, and commanding position. From the outside, it was a symbol of military power, a stronghold, but inside, something else existed. This loneliness was not emptiness. In every room, every corridor, there was a quiet intensity, as if even the stone walls were watching what happened, but chose not to speak. Gilles was no longer simply resting or retreating. He was searching. This search was not a post-victory void. it was a deeper dissatisfaction. He was not only reading books, he studied texts the church considered dangerous, decoded forbidden writings, and explored the meanings of ancient symbols. These were not ordinary religious interpretations. Alchemy, astrology, the relationship between matter and soul, the limits of the human body, the nature of death, and how far human will could go. These were the questions Gilles de Rais pursued. Theoretical answers no longer satisfied him. It was said he conducted alchemical experiments. He sought to understand the transformation of metals, the essence of matter, and its bond with the soul. But these efforts were not merely scientific curiosity. The aim was this: to understand death, to extend life, and perhaps to approach immortality. Some sources claim he communicated with Italian alchemists. These distant names do not appear clearly in official records, but whispers converge on the same point. It was said that special assistants were summoned, foreign individuals came to the castle, and these visits were never recorded. Rituals were said to be performed quietly in hidden chambers of Tiffauges. These rooms were not open to everyone. Some were locked, some marked with symbols, and some doors were never opened. The work Gilles pursued openly conflicted with church doctrine. In the Middle Ages, alchemy, especially experiments concerning death and the soul, was considered dangerous. For this reason, Gilles concealed his research. He worked behind closed doors. He hid his notes. He wrote in symbols. These symbols were not a language everyone could read. Servants could only observe from afar. Some claimed that lights at night stayed on far longer than usual. Others spoke of strange smells within the castle and an unnatural silence. But no one knew exactly what he was doing. Some viewed it as a dangerous yet harmless obsession. Others felt this pursuit would demand a price, because according to medieval belief, searches for such deep and forbidden knowledge never came without consequence. Gilles de Rais had redirected his wealth and power toward these pursuits. The control he once held on the battlefield was now being reshaped in the dark rooms of Tiffauges, and this desire for control would not remain limited to knowledge, because this search would soon raise other questions. Why did some rituals last longer than others? Why were some doors never opened again? And why were some people no longer mentioned after a certain point? The dark pursuits of Gilles de Rais would place him not only as a mysterious figure, but at the center of the disappearances yet to come. And Tiffauges Castle was no longer just a fortress. It had become a threshold where secrets grew heavier and silence took on a dangerous meaning. The mystery of the disappearances. The stone corridors of Tiffauges Castle were silent, but this silence was not a peaceful calm. It was a silence that grew heavier inside you, more disturbing the longer it lasted. The walls were thick, the doors were heavy, sounds stayed inside. They did not escape. Gilles de Rais was becoming increasingly absorbed in alchemy and occult studies. These symbols were no longer just lines to him. Every calculation, every ritual seemed to push the boundary between life and death a little further. But after a while, another pattern began to be noticed inside the castle. Some servants and aides around Gilles were said to bring people at certain intervals into his private workspaces. These summons were said not to be random. Neither inside nor outside were regular records kept. Yet an unusual detail stood out in the castle ledgers. Some names, after a certain point, were no longer mentioned. Those who disappeared were not long-serving adult staff employed by the castle. According to court records and testimonies given years later, They were mostly young people and small children from poor peasant families nearby. Some of these children were brought by Gilles de Rais' servants with promises of work at the castle. Some were told they could serve as helpers or attendants. At times, food or a small payment was used as an incentive. Some children were noticed while begging at the castle gates. Others were taken from their families after being told it was a good opportunity. The servants sensed something was wrong, but there was almost nothing they could do. They must have been sent elsewhere. They ran away. Their duties were reassigned. That was what they chose to believe. But these explanations grew less convincing over time, because the disappearances were not isolated. Gradually, they seemed to follow a pattern. When the castle gates closed, an unusual silence settled inside. No arguments, no movement, no sounds of daily life, only a prolonged stillness. At night, lights in some rooms stayed on far longer than usual. Some servants whispered that they were summoned at night, but by morning, no one heard from them again. These rumors spread beyond the castle walls into nearby villages, and the same question began to echo in everyone's mind. Where were these people going? No one knew a definite answer, but one shared feeling remained. These disappearances were not independent of Gilles de Rais' mysterious pursuits. Every ritual, every symbol seemed to demand something in return. Years later, court records dated 1440 and witness testimonies would bring disturbing claims about these disappearances to light. In these documents, those who vanished were described as young children and the innocent. The numbers were unclear, but some witnesses that claimed the losses may have exceeded 100. Official records noted that certain individuals were never seen again within the castle grounds. Other claims focused on nearby forests, sealed areas, and isolated locations frequently mentioned at the time. Yet, in those years, nothing was certain. Because Gilles de Rais was still extremely powerful. He was a marshal, an aristocrat, and for a long time, no one could question him directly. This only made the disappearances darker still. The stone walls of Tiffauges had learned how to keep secrets, and those secrets lived on for years in whispers. Alchemy, occult rituals, and the believed chain of disappearances. This dark sequence began to turn Gilles de Rais into more than a powerful noble, into one of history's most controversial, most unsettling, and darkest figures. But still, it was not over, because the whispers would eventually reach the ears of authorities, and this time, silence would not protect him. Collapse and the judgment of history. For years, the whispers drifting through the stone corridors of Tiffauges Castle eventually crossed beyond its walls. Peasants, servants, and those living nearby were speaking of the same disappearances, the same silences. These rumors had become too widespread to ignore. By the year 1440, the name Gilles de Rais was no longer spoken only as that of a former war hero, but alongside dark accusations. At this point, two forces moved at the same time: local authorities and the church. Long accumulating complaints, witness accounts, and claims of disappearances opened the path to a formal process. Gilles de Rais was arrested. This arrest was not merely the detention of a nobleman, it was the first serious questioning of a power long considered untouchable. When the trial began, the alchemical and occult activities conducted in his castles were no longer matters of curiosity, but accusations entered into official records. Witnesses spoke of sealed rooms, activities said to continue at night, and those who vanished. In court documents, the missing were frequently described as young children and the innocent. They were not long-serving adult staff of the castle. They were mostly young people and children from poor local families, said to have been brought in from outside. There was no consensus on exact numbers. However, some witnesses acclaimed the disappearances may have exceeded 100. Throughout the trial, Gilles de Rais' reputation collapsed step by step. Once, a marshal who served the king, he now appeared to confront the darker sides of his own power. His alchemical and occult pursuits did not defend him. They made him appear even more suspect. The court found Gilles de Rais guilty, and within the legal framework of the time, he was sentenced to one of the harshest penalties. Along with him, the secrets hidden within the stone walls of Tiffauges Castle were said to have been brought into the open. But this story did not end there, because the case of Gilles de Rais continued to be debated for centuries. Some historians argued the trial may have been shaped by political and economic motives. Others pointed to the details within the court records and argued for the reality of the accusations. Whatever the truth, history shows one thing clearly: power that cannot be questioned will eventually be forced to answer. And Tiffauges Castle was no longer just a stone structure, but a symbol with forbidden rooms, lost names, and dark whispers that inspired the legend of Bluebeard. Gilles de Rais in history. Was he a hero or a dark figure? That question still lacks a definitive answer today. But one thing is certain: his story shows unforgettable, where power, silence, and darkness can lead when they come together. History has delivered its judgment. But what about you? What do you think about Gilles de Rais?